Another edition of Things Bryan Kohberger doesn't like about prison. It's a long list, so get comfy. And I, for one, am delighted by it.
He's in their world now. They have started to torment him through the vent systems within inside of the block where he's being held.
At 19 minutes past 4 in the morning, a young woman stood frozen in her bedroom doorway and watched a stranger walk past her. He wore black. A mask covered the lower half of his face. He did not look like he was in a hurry. He moved toward the back of the house with the calm of a man who already knew the way out. She would later tell police she remembered one thing about him above all else: his eyebrows, dark, bushy. She did not scream. She did not run. Some part of her body decided, in that frozen second, that the safest thing she could do was nothing at all. So she closed her door. And for the next 8 hours, she had no idea that the 3 friends she had laughed with the night before, and the kind young man who made one of them happier than she had ever seen her, were already gone. This is the detail almost every telling of this story skips. A living witness stood a few feet from the man who had just murdered 4 people. He saw her, and he let her live. A man who had planned every step, who studied murder for a living, who could recite from memory exactly how killers get caught, made a choice in that hallway that should have destroyed him within days. It didn't. What destroyed him was something far smaller, something he left behind on a bed, inches from one of his victims. And the reason a criminology student left it there, the reason he made the one mistake he had spent years teaching others to avoid, is the same reason that, 3 years later, he is sitting in a maximum security cell in Idaho, reportedly trying to make friends with serial killers, not to confess, not to repent, to network, to be seen by the only people he believes are worthy of seeing him as one of their own. Stay with me, because by the end of this you are going to understand something the courtroom never made him say out loud. You are going to see how a man who believed he was smarter than everyone around him became so consumed with proving it that he crossed a line he could never come back from. And you will understand why his behavior in prison today tells us more about why he did it than any speech he could have given under oath. If you want the full story, the warnings that were ignored, the science that caught him, and the fight for accountability that is still going on right now, subscribe to this channel and keep watching. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know who is here for this one. Now let me take you back. To understand the night of November 13th, 2022, you first have to understand the 11 weeks before it, because the warning signs were not hidden. They were not subtle. They were documented, reported, and discussed by people whose entire careers were built on recognizing exactly this kind of danger, and almost nobody managed to stop it. 8 miles from the house on King Road sat Washington State University, in Pullman, just across the state line, and in the fall of 2022, a new doctoral student arrived in the criminal justice program there. He was in his late 20s, quiet, by most accounts. He had a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's in criminal justice, and now he was chasing the highest credential in his field, a PhD in criminology, at one of the more respected programs in the country. On paper, he was unremarkable. No criminal record, no history of violence. The kind of student a department barely notices. He did not stay unnoticed for long. In late August, just as the semester began, an instructor was assigned to oversee his doctoral work. Almost immediately, the complaints started arriving. Not vague discomfort, specific incidents reported by specific people. Female graduate students, faculty members, staff. They described a man who was condescending and hostile, and whose hostility was aimed, again and again, at women. One graduate student began leaving her office door open on purpose, because she had become convinced this man was going to do something inappropriate to a student. She described him to others as a stalker type, a sexual assaulter type. Another student went further. She called him a possible future rapist. These were not strangers passing judgment. These were people training in the study of criminal behavior, evaluating a colleague based on what they watched him do every single day. And what he did followed a pattern. He would walk into offices where female graduate students worked and position himself in the doorway, blocking the only way out. He would simply stand there. The women learned to recognize it. One of them would say, out loud, that she needed to leave, and a faculty member would have to physically step into the room to break the standoff and create an exit. This did not happen once. It happened repeatedly. He stared. Students described looking up in the middle of a lecture to find him watching them. He timed his departures from class to match when certain women were leaving, and then he followed them to their cars. The behavior became alarming enough that the university began arranging escorts. After 5 p.m, women in the department were no longer walking to their vehicles alone. Sometimes a professor walked them. Sometimes the campus police did. One woman fled a classroom in tears after he turned on her during a discussion, an outburst so sudden and so cutting that she left her belongings behind and did not feel safe returning. Another graduate student said he cornered her in her office and trapped her there, talking, of all things, about the murders committed by Ted Bundy. By the middle of September, faculty members were privately discussing the need for an intervention. They were trading messages, trying to figure out how to handle this without setting him off. One professor set up a secret emergency signal with a frightened student. If she ever felt unsafe, she was to send an email with the subject line 911 and help would come. And then there was the warning, the one that, looking back, is almost unbearable to read. One faculty member, a woman who had spent her career studying violent offenders, people whose minds she understood at a professional level, told her colleagues that this student needed to be removed. She wanted his funding cut. She wanted him out of the teaching program. And she told them why, in words investigators would later write down. She said that if he was allowed to finish his PhD and become a professor, they would one day hear that he was harassing, stalking, and sexually abusing his own students. She said he was smart enough that in 4 years they would have no choice but to hand him the degree. She said plainly that she works with predators, and she warned them to mark her words. She was right about almost everything. She was wrong about only one thing: the timeline. The violence did not come in 4 years when he became a professor. It came in 11 weeks. The university's response to all of this was procedural. 9 separate formal complaints had stacked up by autumn, from faculty, from staff, from fellow students, about his rude and belittling behavior toward women, and the institutional answer was a mandatory training session on appropriate behavior, which all the graduate students were required to attend. He went. According to accounts later given to investigators, he sat in the back of the room, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. Think about what a message like that communicates to the right kind of person. To most people, formal discipline is a wall. It says, stop, there are consequences here. But to a man who has already decided he operates on a level above everyone around him, a man who believes the ordinary rules were written for ordinary people, that same message lands completely differently. It does not say stop. It says the system can be managed. It says these people, with their meetings and their training sessions and their polite paperwork, do not actually have the power to touch me. For a man like that, discipline is not a warning. It is confirmation. And while all of this was unfolding on one campus, 8 miles away, something else was being set in motion. If you are finding this useful, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because the part that comes next is the part the families are still fighting over in court right now, and I want you here for it. Let's keep going. The house at 1122 King Road was a 3-story rental near the edge of campus, the kind of place where students gathered and felt safe. It had 6 bedrooms spread across 3 floors. On the night of Saturday, November 12th, the people inside it were doing exactly what you would expect college students to be doing on a Saturday night. Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogan, both 21, went out together in town. They had been best friends since the 6th grade, so close that the people who knew them said separating their 2 lives was almost impossible. Kaylee was a senior. She had already finished the credits she needed to graduate. A marketing firm in Austin, Texas, had offered her a job, and she was set to start after the holidays. She had, in every real sense, already made it out the door and into her future. That night was supposed to be one of the last ordinary nights of her old life. Madison was a senior too, studying marketing, close to her own graduation, building a future alongside the people she loved most. Ethan Chapin, 20, was a freshman, one of a set of triplets, with a brother and sister also attending the same university. People who knew him said he lit up every room he entered. That night he went to a formal event with his sister, then came to the house with his girlfriend, Xana Kernodle. Xana, also 20, was a junior studying marketing. She and Ethan had returned to the house in the early hours of the morning. For the first time in her life, by the accounts of the people who loved her, Xana was in love. 2 more roommates were in the house that night as well. They had been out, and they came home, and they went to their rooms. They survived. Remember them, because what one of them witnessed becomes the hinge the entire case turns on. At around 4 in the morning, Xana placed a DoorDash order, a small, ordinary thing. A hungry college student at the end of a long night. But it means that at 4 in the morning, at least one person in that house was very likely awake. Outside, a white Hyundai Elantra was moving through the neighborhood. Investigators would later pull the surveillance footage and find something that turns your stomach once you understand it. The car did not simply arrive. It passed the area around the house and passed it again and again. 3 times it circled. And then, at 4 minutes past 4 in the morning, it came back a 4th time. And this time, it stopped. A man got out and went to a sliding glass door at the back of the house, on the 2nd floor. Not the front door, not the obvious way in, a specific door. He moved through the kitchen and made his way up toward the top floor, and the way he navigated that house, the path he took, suggested to investigators that this was not the first time he had thought carefully about its layout. What happened over the next several minutes is the part I will not turn into entertainment. These were not characters. They were 4 young people asleep in their own beds, in their own home, who had done nothing to anyone. By most reconstructions, the attack lasted only a few minutes. 3 of them never fully woke. One of them, the evidence showed, fought. She did not go quietly. She tried to defend herself. And then it was over, and the man came back down through the house to leave. That is when the door opened. One of the surviving roommates, awakened by sounds she could not place, opened her bedroom door at around 19 minutes past 4, and there he was, a man in black, a mask over the lower half of his face, walking past her toward the back of the house. She froze. She would tell police she fell into a kind of shock, a paralysis, and she remembered his eyebrows above everything else, dark and bushy. He did not stop for her. He did not turn back. He walked out, and moments later, the neighbor's camera caught the car pulling away so fast it nearly lost control taking the corner. Sit with how strange that is. He had just done the unthinkable, and on his way out, he met a living witness, a person who could see him, who could later describe him, and he let her live. The criminologists who studied this case offered one theory, that by that point he was simply spent, physically exhausted, and that a roommate who did not engage him was not worth the energy. We may never truly know, but that choice, to leave a witness behind, should have been the thing that ended him. It wasn't, because he had already left behind something worse for himself. Now watch what he did next, because this is the part that tells you exactly who he was. He did not panic. He did not race straight home on the highway. According to prosecutors, he drove the back roads, avoiding the main routes and the cameras that watched them. He kept his cell phone switched off until 48 minutes past 4, so that it could not be traced retracing his path. By 26 minutes past 5 in the morning, he was back in Pullman, back near his apartment, back in his life. This was not the behavior of a man who had lost control in a fit of rage. This was a man executing a plan, and then calmly executing a cover-up. The methodical care of someone who had studied, in detail, how other people in his position had been caught, and who believed he was about to demonstrate that he was better than all of them. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong was a single object, left on a bed beside one of the victims, a leather sheath, the cover for a K-bar knife. He had left the scene with the weapon, but the sheath stayed behind, and on the button snap of that sheath was a tiny trace of male DNA. The man who studied mistakes for a living had just made the only one that mattered. For weeks, the town of Moscow lived in fear. There had not been a murder there since 2015, and now 4 young people were dead, and no one knew who had done it. Police asked the public for help. Thousands of tips came in, and slowly, 2 threads began to pull together. The first was a description, from a surviving roommate, of a masked man who was not very muscular but athletically built, around 5 feet 10 or taller, with bushy eyebrows. The second was a vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra, seen near the scene, that investigators desperately wanted to identify. That car came onto the radar, in part, because a campus officer had been told to watch for that exact model. When investigators ran a registration and looked at the driver, they noticed something in his photograph. His eyebrows, bushy, consistent with what the witness had described. But the thing that closed the case was the sheath. The DNA on it did not match anyone in the criminal databases because the man it belonged to had no record. So investigators turned to a newer tool, investigative genetic genealogy. They ran the unknown DNA against public genealogy databases, the kind ordinary people use to find distant cousins and build family trees. And it gave them a family, a lineage. They followed that lineage down its branches until it pointed at one man. Then targeted testing confirmed it. The DNA on the sheath was his. There is a cruel irony layered into all of this that you cannot miss. By the middle of December, he was already a person of interest, and investigators were watching. He had set out on a long cross-country drive to his parents' home in Pennsylvania, his father riding along, and law enforcement tracked that drive across the country. During it, in Indiana, he was even pulled over by local officers, twice in the same day, for ordinary traffic matters, and let go both times. A man who would soon be charged with 4 murders, sitting in the very car police nationwide were hunting, handed back his documents and waved on. The net was already closing. He just couldn't see it. On the 30th of December, 2022, officers executed a search warrant at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, in the Pocono Mountains, and arrested him. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The man who walked out of the house at 1122 King Road was finally in custody. But the single question that mattered most was still unanswered. Why? Why those 4 people? Why that house? Why that night? And the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan would wait nearly 3 more years for an answer that, in the end, never came. We are about to get to that courtroom, and to the silence that came after it, the silence that I believe tells you everything. But first, if this story is hitting you the way it hits me, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps these cases reach more people, and it helps make sure the people who failed here are not allowed to be forgotten. Okay, the courtroom. On the 2nd of July, 2025, in a courtroom in Boise, the man stood up and pleaded guilty. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of burglary. The plea was part of a deal. In exchange for admitting what he had done and waiving his right to appeal, he would be spared the death penalty. For the families, this was not the moment they had been promised for nearly 3 years. They had sat through hearing after hearing, motion after motion, delay after delay, bracing themselves for a trial. They had expected to finally hear it. The testimony, the cross-examination, the moment a prosecutor forced him to stand in front of the world and explain himself under oath. The plea took all of that off the table. No trial, no witnesses, no explanation. The prosecutor, Bill Thompson, made that choice deliberately, and his reasoning deserves your full attention because it is the key to this entire case. He had the evidence, the DNA, the car, the cell phone data, the genealogy. It was overwhelming. He could have pushed for the trial. He could have tried to force the man onto the stand. He chose not to, and when asked why, he explained that he did not believe anything the man might say about his motive would ever be honest. He believed any explanation would be self-serving, calculated, designed to manage how the world saw him rather than to tell the truth. Read that again. The prosecutor, who knew this case better than anyone, looked at the prospect of finally getting an answer and concluded that whatever came out of this man's mouth would not be an answer at all. It would be a performance, and he refused to hand him the stage. On the 23rd of July, 2025, the judge, Stephen Hippler, sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for the burglary, plus financial penalties to the families. He will die in prison. He will never have another day of freedom. When the judge gave him the chance to speak, to say something, anything, to the families who had waited so long, he declined. He stood there showing no emotion at all. The judge, before passing sentence, called him a faceless coward, and spoke of his awe at the strength of the families who had stood up to address him. And those families did address him. One sister stood and asked him directly what her sister's last words had been, her voice never wavering, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. A father taunted him for being so careless, so foolish, as to leave his DNA behind and get caught, despite all his supposed expertise. He gave them nothing back. No remorse, no acknowledgement, no why. I want to be fair and complete here, because responsible storytelling demands it. His defense had earlier raised a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, arguing it should be treated as a mitigating factor. The court did not accept that as a barrier to the sentence, and it is important to say clearly that this diagnosis explains nothing about the violence and excuses nothing about it. Autism does not make a person dangerous. The overwhelming majority of people with that diagnosis will never harm anyone. I mention it only so that you have the full picture, and so that no one walks away from this with a false and harmful connection in their head. So, the legal system did its job. It delivered certainty, a conviction, a sentence, a guarantee that this man will never walk free. What it could not deliver was the one thing the families needed most: understanding, the silence where the answer should be. But here is what I have come to believe: the answer was never going to come from his mouth. The prosecutor understood that the answer was always going to come from the record, from the pattern, and from what he has done since the cell door closed behind him. Because the man who refused to explain himself in court has been anything but silent in prison. In the summer of 2025, he arrived at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution and was placed in one of its most restrictive units, where he is confined alone for 23 hours a day with a single hour outside. And almost immediately, the complaints began. He complained about the food. He complained about other inmates taunting him through the air vents, around the clock, in shifts, refusing to let him sleep. The prison itself confirmed it was aware of his complaints about what he considered taunting. According to a retired homicide detective named Chris McDonough, who says he has a source with knowledge of conditions inside the facility, the man eventually went further. McDonough has said publicly that the inmate implied he would harm himself if he was not moved out of his unit. And McDonough, who has spent a career around this kind of behavior, did not read that as a genuine crisis. He compared it to a tantrum, a child threatening to hold his breath until he gets what he wants, a manipulation tactic aimed at the system, designed to bend it. I want to be careful and honest with you here. Much of what we know about his day-to-day behavior in prison comes from this one retired investigator citing a source, not from official records, so hold it as reporting rather than proven fact. But hold this next part too, because it is the part that matters most, and it fits everything that came before it. According to that same reporting, he has been trying to make contact with serial killers, not seeking counseling, not looking for support or guidance from anyone who might help him understand what he has become. He has reportedly been reaching out to high-profile murderers around the country, attempting to build connections with them, inside the walls and outside them. Stop and think about what that would mean. This is a man who will never leave prison. His appeals are gone. His legal options are exhausted. He has nothing left to gain, no audience left to impress, no future left to protect. And yet, if the reporting is right, he still considers himself above every ordinary inmate around him. The only people he regards as his peers are the most notorious killers he can find. The same way he once built an academic identity by studying the most extreme offenders he could find, positioning himself in relation to them, he is now, from a cell, trying to position himself among them in the flesh. He studied serial killers in a classroom. Now he studies them from down the hall, and he appears to be convinced that he belongs with them. That is the answer. Not a clean sentence, not a single grievance, or a specific rejection that you can point to and say, there, that is why. The motive that emerges from the whole record is something harder and darker than that. It is the portrait of a man whose sense of his own superiority was so total, so untreated, so resistant to every warning and every correction and every consequence the world tried to place in front of him, that it eventually had nowhere left to go but into violence. He spent years learning how killers think. He internalized their methods. He studied the ones who planned, who controlled, who left almost nothing behind. And somewhere in those 11 weeks in the fall of 2022, the line between studying that world and wanting to enter it dissolved. He stopped being a student of violence. He decided to author it. He set out, it seems, to commit something controlled enough and clever enough to place him in the category of people he had spent his life admiring. The sheath on the bed says he failed. The DNA says he failed. The genealogy, the cameras, the cell phone data, all of it says he failed. He was not the genius he believed himself to be. He was a man who left the one piece of evidence that ended him on a bed next to a young woman he had just killed. But the belief did not die when the case closed. It survived the arrest. It survived the plea. It survived the sentence. And if the reporting from inside that prison is accurate, it is alive, right now, today, in a cell in Idaho, in a man who still thinks he is better than everyone around him and who only wants to talk to killers. Now hold that image against another one. Kaylee Gonsalves was 21. She had finished her degree, packed up her old life, and had a job waiting for her in Texas. She was saying goodbye to her childhood best friend before stepping into her future. Madison Mogan was 21. She was studying marketing, weeks from her own graduation, building a life with the people she loved. Xana Kernodle was 20. She was in love for the first time. She had a sister who adored her and dreams about whatever was supposed to come next. Ethan Chapin was 20, one of 3, a brother, a friend, the person who lit up the room, loved by everyone who knew him. They were not case numbers. They were not data points in someone's psychological profile. They were 4 people with families and futures, and all of it was taken from them in a few minutes before dawn by a man who decided that his need to prove something to himself was worth more than every single thing they would ever have been. The system gave their families 4 life sentences. It gave the world a conviction, but it could not fill the silence, and it could not undo the failure that came before it, because this story does not actually begin in that house. It begins on a campus 8 miles away, where 9 complaints piled up, where a faculty member predicted exactly what this man was capable of, where women were escorted to their cars because they were afraid, and where the institutional response to all of it was a training session he sat through staring at the ceiling. That is why this is not over. Right now, in 2026, the family of Kaylee Gonsalves is pursuing a lawsuit against Washington State University, arguing that the warnings were there, that they were documented, that they were ignored, and that an institution has to be held accountable when it sees a danger this clearly and does so little. The case is ongoing. The fight for accountability is still being fought. And that fight matters far beyond this one man, because the real lesson here is uncomfortable. The warning signs in this case were not faint. They were not the kind of thing you only see in hindsight. People saw them in real time. People wrote them down. A trained expert said his name and predicted his future out loud. And it still was not enough. So the question this case leaves us with is not really about him. It is about us. How many times do we explain away the behavior that frightens us? How many warnings get filed into a folder instead of acted on? How many people see exactly what is in front of them and say it plainly and are still not enough to change what happens next? The man in that cell will never tell us why. He has made that clear, but the record told us anyway. Every complaint, every warning, every time someone was made to feel small so that he could feel large, the sheath he left behind, the silence he chose in court, and the company he reportedly keeps in his own mind, even now, with the door locked behind him forever. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me, and for treating this with the seriousness these 4 people deserve. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the next part of this story, the science that caught him, the warnings in full, and the accountability fight still unfolding, is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. And remember, the 4 names that should never have left us this way. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, Ethan. The truth deserves to be told completely. They deserve to be remembered.